The rust-colored dust of the unpaved driveway was a permanent stain on the soul of the place. It coated the dead leaves, the splintered porch steps, and the very air Jake Callahan breathed. He sat on the top step of the derelict farmhouse, a ghost haunting the graveyard of his own family history. The November wind was a bitter old woman whispering through the broken panes of glass in the upstairs windows, telling stories of decay he already knew by heart. Each morning was a negotiation with the dawn. He'd wake on a thin mattress on the floor of the living room, the cold floorboards leaching warmth from his body. The first coherent thought was always the same, a roll call of the dead: Miller, Rossi, Diaz, and Marcus. Always Marcus. Their faces swam in the dim light, young and vital, frozen in the amber of a sun-baked Afghan morning, just before the world had dissolved into fire and screaming. He ran a hand over his face, the rough calluses catching on the stubble of his jaw, the phantom pain in his left leg, the one the doctors had pieced back. Together with titanium and a prayer was a dull, rhythmic throb. It was his metronome, the beat to which his broken life now marched. He had been a master chief in the United States Navy SEALs, a warrior, a leader of men who walked into the darkest corners of the world and made them safe. Now, he was just a man with too many ghosts and not enough whiskey to drown them. The bank sent letters. He used them for kindling. The VA sent pamphlets about support groups and therapy. He threw them in the trash. They couldn't understand. How could they? They had been there. They had felt the concussion wave lift them off their feet, hadn't tasted the cordite and vaporized earth, hadn't held their brother hand as the light faded from his eyes. Marcus had looked at him, a question in his gaze that Jake still couldn't answer. Why, you and not me? That was the question that echoed in the hollow spaces of the farmhouse. It was in the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind, the mournful hoot of an owl in the skeletal oak tree that dominated the yard. He had been discharged, deemed medically unfit for duty. The citation for valor they getting given him felt like a brand, a mark of his failure to bring them all home. They called him a hero. He felt like a fraud who had simply been standing in the right place to survive and the wrong place to die. His world had shrunk to the 30 acres of forgotten farmland his grandfather had left him. It was a fitting purgatory. The fields were fallow, the barn sagged on its foundation like an old man with a broken spine, and the fences were little more than suggestions of a boundary. It was a perfect mirror of the man who now inhabited it, broken, empty, waiting for the end. He lived off his disability pension, a monthly deposit that felt like blood money. It was enough for cheap coffee, canned beans, and the occasional bottle of bourbon that promised a few hours of blessed numbness. He spoke to no one. The nearest town was 10 miles away, and he only went when supplies ran low, moving through the grocery store aisles like a wraith, his eyes downcast, his presence a heavy silent thing that made people give him a wide berth. They saw the scars that snaked up his neck from beneath his collar, the rigid set of his jaw, the haunted emptiness in his eyes, and they left him alone. It was all he asked for. This particular morning the cold was sharper, more insistent. It bit at the exposed skin of his hands as he nursed a mug of black coffee. The world was painted in shades of gray and brown. Across the overgrown field that separated his property from his only neighboring was the Miller place. Old Man Miller was a creature of local legend, a sour recluse who was even more isolated than Jake. They two never spoken, only exchanged a single hard-eyed nod from a distance once. Miller and property was even worse than his own. A collection of rusted machinery and collapsing sheds that looked like the aftermath of a localized apocalypse. It was then that he heard it. At first, it was just a flicker of sound on the edge of the wind, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of dead leaves. He paused, his coffee mug halfway to his lips, his head cocked, his senses, honed by years of listening for the snap of a twig or the scrape of a boot in the hostile dark, were still razor sharp. They were a curse, mostly, amplifying the mundane sounds of his solitude into threats that never materialized. But this was different. It came again, thin and reedy, a whimper. a sound of pure, undiluted misery that cut through the gray morning like a shard of glass. It was the sound of a creature in pain, a creature giving up. Jake set his mug down on the splintered wood of the porch step. He stood, his bad leg protesting with a sharp, grinding ache. He stared across the field toward the Miller place. The sound had come from there, from a dilapidated shed near the back of the property, half hidden by a thicket of overgrown briars. For a moment he considered. It wasn't his business. Miller was a mean drunk, by all accounts. Getting involved was a bad idea. He had enough of his own demons to fight without inviting someone else, or he'd spent years building walls around his heart, thick and high, to keep the world out. He had no room for anything else. The whimper came a third time, weaker now, followed by the harsh metallic rattle of a chain. Something inside Jake, a part of him he thought had died in the Afghan dust, with his men stirred. It was the old instinct, the one that said you don't leave a man behind, the one that said you stand for those who can't stand for themselves. It was the code he had lived by, and the code he thought he had abandoned. He turned and went back inside the house, not for a weapon, but for the worn leatherwork gloves on the counter. He pulled them on, the familiar feel of the leather, a small comfort. He walked off the porch, his boots sinking into the damp earth, and started across the field. He didn't know what he was going to do, or what he was going to say. He only knew that he couldn't sit on his porch and listen to that sound anymore. He couldn't be that man. Not today. The fence between the properties was a joke, more rust than wire. He stepped over easily and moved toward the sound, his steps silent, his body low. He moved like a predator, a habit forged in environments where noise meant death. The smell of rot and damp earth grew stronger as he approached the shed. The door hung askew on one hinge, a dark maw leading into shadow. He peered inside. The interior was a junk-filled mess, smelling of mildew and something else, something acrid and foul. In the far corner a shape resolved itself from the gloom. It was a dog, a German shepherd, or what was left of one. Its coat was matted with filth and mud. Its ribs a stark, horrifying landscape under its skin. A heavy rusted chain was padlocked around its neck, tethered to a steel post, driven into the dirt floor. The chain was short, giving it only a few feet of movement. An overturned, algae, slicked bucket lay nearby, clearly meant for water. There was no food. The dog lifted its head slowly, the effort seeming to cost it everything. Its eyes met Jake's, and in that moment, the world stopped. Jake had seen those eyes before. He'd seen them in the faces of young soldiers after their first firefight. He'd seen them in the eyes of refugees fleeing a war-torn village. He saw them every morning in his own reflection. They were eyes that had seen too much, suffered too much, and had given up all hope of ever seeing anything else. They were broken. The dog didn't growl. It didn't bark. It just lay there, a faint tremor running through its emaciated frame, and watched him with a profound, soul-deep weariness that Jake understood completely. He saw himself in that animal, the same scars, the same isolation, the same quiet surrender to the pain, a cold, clean rage, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, washed through him. It wasn't the hot, chaotic anger of combat. It was a righteous, glacial fury. This was wrong, a simple, absolute, and unforgivable wrong. "Hey, what the hell you doing on my property?" The voice was a gravelly snarl from behind him. Jake straightened up slowly, turning to face the man who had just emerged from the back door of the dilapidated house. It was Miller. He was a wiry man in his late 60s, with a face like a dried apple, and small, mean eyes. He held a rusty shotgun, held loosely but with clear intent. "Your dog," Jake said, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. "It's hurt. Ain't your concern," Miller spat, taking a step closer. The smell of stale liquor wafted from him. "That's a guard dog. He's mean, supposed to be. Now get off my land before you find out how mean I can be." Jaking eyes flickered from Miller to the dog, which had lowered its head back to the dirt floor, as if the effort of holding it up was too much. "He's not mean," Jake said, his voice flat and cold. "He's starving." Miller laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He gets what he earns. Ain't earned nothing lately. Just lays there, whining, useless. He gestured with the shotgun. I said, get. Jake didn't move. The old training was kicking in, overriding the fog of his depression. He assessed the threat. Old man, likely drunk, unsteady on his feet. Shotgun was an old single barrel, likely poorly maintained. His own stance was balanced, his hands free. The distance was about 15 feet. He could close it in under 2 seconds. I'm taking a dog, Jake stated. It wasn't a request. Miller's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief, followed by a surge of belligerent anger. You ain't taking nothing. That's my property. You trespassing. I could shoot you right here, and the law wouldn't do a damn thing. Try it, Jake whispered, and the word hung in the air between them, heavy and lethal. The ghost in the farmhouse was gone. In its place stood a Master Chief Petty Officer of the United States Navy SEALs. Miller saw the change. He saw the absolute absence of fear in Jake's eyes, replaced by something cold and final. Miller in bravado faltered. His grip on the shotgun tightened, but his finger wasn't near the trigger. He's a menace, Miller blustered, trying to regain his footing. You don't know him. You let him off that chain, he'll tear you apart. He took a half step back, a subconscious retreat. He jabbed the shotgun barrel toward the shed. You want him so bad? Go on, just open the gate. The words were meant as a challenge, a final, desperate attempt to scare him off. But for Jake, they were a command, an unlocking of a door he had kept sealed for years. He held Miller's gaze for a second longer, a silent promise of what would happen if the old man moved. Then he turned his back on him, a calculated act of dominance, and walked into the shed. He knelt in the dirt beside the German shepherd. The dog flinched as he approached, a low, fearful sound rumbling in its chest. It was the sound of an animal that expected only pain from a human hand. Easy, boy, Jake murmured, his voice softer than he'd heard it in years. I'm not going to hurt you. He ignored the padlock. The chain was thick, but the steel ring it was attached to on the post was old and rusted. He wrapped his gloved hands around it. He planted his feet, his bad legs screaming in protest. He focused, channeling the years of pain, of loss, of fury. Into his arms and shoulders he pulled. The metal groaned. The muscles in his back and arms bunched into knots of iron. For a moment, nothing happened. The dog watched him, its weary eyes wide with confusion. Miller was shouting something from the doorway, but the voice was distant, irrelevant. There was only the cold metal in his hands and the broken creature at his feet. With a final, guttural roar of effort, the steel ring tore from the wooden post with a splintering shriek. Jake stumbled back, the chain clattering to the floor. He stood breathing heavily and looked at the dog. The dog looked back, then at the broken chain, then back at him. A flicker of something, not hope, but something less bleak than despair, entered its eyes. Jake slowly extended the hand, palm down. The dog watched it, then hesitantly, with infinite slowness, it rose on trembling legs. It took a step, then another. It leaned forward and touched its cold, dry nose to Jake's fingertips. It was a gesture of trust so profound, so fragile, that it felt like a physical blow to Jake's chest. He gently took hold of the chain still hanging from the dog's neck and led it out of the shed. Miller stood there, his mouth agape, the shotgun hanging forgotten at his side. He looked from the massive, scarred man to the dog walking placidly beside him, and for the first time he looked truly afraid. Jake didn't say a word. He just walked past the old man leading the dog across the dead field, back toward the ghost of a farmhouse that was, for the first time in a very long time, about to have a new resident. He was bringing a brother home. The journey back across the field was slow. The dog stumbled every few steps, its back legs weak from malnutrition and disuse. Jake kept the pace deliberate, his hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulder, a steadying presence. He could feel the animal's bones through its thin, matted coat. Each tremor that ran through its frame was a testament to its suffering. Inside his house, the dog collapsed onto the worn rag rug in front of the cold fireplace, its breath coming in shallow, exhausted sighs. Jake brought a bowl of water, placing it gently in front of the dog's nose. The animal drank, lap after lap, with a desperate thirst that was painful to watch. He didn't offer food yet. He knew from his training that giving a starving creature too much food too quickly could kill it. Small amounts carefully. He sat on the floor a few feet away, just watching the dog. After drinking its fill, laid its head on its paws and closed its eyes, but it didn't sleep. Its ears twitched at every creak of the old house. It was on high alert, even in its exhaustion, a soldier's habit. The next morning Jake drove his battered pickup into town. His first stop was the feed store for a bag of high-quality dog food. His second was the hardware store for a pair of bolt cutters. Back at the farm he carefully cut the heavy padlock and removed the chain from the dog's neck. The fur underneath was raw and infected. A permanent, ugly scar was already forming. Another warrior, marked by his battle. He cleaned the wound as gently as he could. The dog bore the sting of the antiseptic without a whimper, its trust in him absolute. Jake felt a knot in his own throat. This quiet courage, this resilience in the face of such cruelty, was a humbling thing to witness. He knew the dog needed a real doctor. The county vet was a small clinic, run by a woman named Anya Sharma. Jake had seen her in town. She was sharp, no nonsense. He loaded the dog into the passenger seat of his truck. The animal was hesitant at first, but a soft word and a gentle hand were enough to coax it inside. Dr. Ray? Sharma. Clinic was clean, bright, and smelled of bleach and animal fear, a stark contrast to his own decaying world when he walked in, the German shepherd limping at his side. The receptionist's welcoming smile froze on her face. She saw him, not the dog. She saw the scars, the grim set of his mouth, the darkness that clung to him like a shroud. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice suddenly cautious. "He needs a vet," Jake said simply, gesturing to the dog. "Doctor—" Sharma emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on a towel. She was a woman in her late 30s, with intelligent, dark eyes that missed nothing. She took in the scene, the intimidating man and the emaciated dog, and her expression became a mask of professional neutrality. But Jake could see the flicker of suspicion in her eyes. She probably thought he was the one who had hurt the dog. The thought sent a surprising pang of hurt through him. "In here," she said, her tone clipped, leading them into an examination room. She was gentle with the dog, her hands skilled and confident. The dog, in turn, was a model patient. It stood stoically on the cold metal table. As she examined it, its eyes fixed on Jake, drawing strength from his presence. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, multiple infections, both skin and internal. "Looks like some older, poorly healed fractures in his back leg," she recited, her voice a low, angry hum. "And this," she pointed to the raw wound on its neck. This was a chain, a heavy one, padlocked. She looked up, her dark eyes pinning Jake to the wall. "Where did you get this dog?" "My neighbor's," Jake said, his voice level. "He wasn't taking care of him." "Taking care of him." "This is criminal abuse. Did you report it?" "I handled it," Jake replied. Her lips thinned. "By handled it, do you mean you stole him?" "I liberated him," Jake corrected, a hint of the old steel in his voice. "Doctor—" Sharma stared at him for a long moment, a silent battle of wills passing between them. She saw something in his eyes then, a deep, resonant pain that mirrored the dog's, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. She turned her attention back to the animal. "I'll need to run some blood work, get him on antibiotics and a careful feeding schedule. He can't stay here. We don't have the kennel space for long-term care." She was testing him. "He's staying with me," Jake said, leaving no room for argument. As she worked, she ran a microchip scanner over the dog's back. It beeped. "Well, at least he's chipped. Let's see who the registered owner is." She frowned at the scanner's display. "That's odd. It's an encrypted frequency, 15 digits. Standard chips are 10 or 13. This is a military-grade chip." Jake felt a jolt, a sudden cold premonition. "Military?" he asked, his voice tight. "Or federal?" she said. Her curiosity piqued. I've seen it once before on a retired ALV dog. Her fingers continued their expert probing, checking the dog's ears for mites. Hold on, what's this? She carefully cleaned a patch of dirt from the inside of the dog's right ear. Underneath the grime was a faded tattoo. It was small, barely legible, but Jake recognized it instantly. His blood ran cold. It was a trident bisected by an anchor and an eagle, the insignia of the United States Navy SEALs, and below it a series of numbers and letters. Jake felt the room tilt. He knew that marking. He had seen it on the K9S that worked with the teams. He had seen it on Odin, Marcus's dog, the one who had been with him in the Humvee, the one who had died beside him. What is it? Anya asked, seeing the color drain from his face. Jake reached out a trembling hand and gently touched the tattoo. The dog leaned into his touch, as if sensing his distress. It's a unit marking, he said, his voice a choked whisper. My unit. The implications crashed down on him. A SEAL dog, a high-value asset, abused and left to rot on a drunk's farm miles from any base. It made no sense. These dogs were heroes. They were retired with honor, often adopted by their handlers. They didn't just disappear. I need to make a call, Jake said, his mind racing. Who would know who was still in the world he had left behind? Dr. Sharma finished her work, dressing the wound on the dog's neck and administering the first round of antibiotics. Her demeanor had changed completely. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a deep, troubled curiosity. She saw the tattoo, she saw the look on Jake's face, and she understood that this was something far more complex than a simple case of animal cruelty. He's stable for now, she said, her voice softer. I've given him some fluids. The feeding plan is on this sheet. Small meals, 4 times a day, no strenuous activity, and bring him back in 3 days. She hesitated. Whatever this is, be careful. Jake just nodded, his mind 1,000 miles away, back in the dust and the fire. He'd pay for the visit in cash, his emergency fund dwindling to almost nothing. He didn't care. He helped the dog, who was now slightly sedated, back into the truck. On the drive home, the dog slept in the passenger seat, its head on Jake's thigh. Jake drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the dog's flank, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breathing. He wasn't just a dog anymore, he was a mystery, a ghost from Jake's past wearing a different face. Back at the farm, Jake settled the dog back on the rug and stared at the silent phone on his kitchen counter. There was only one person who might have answers, a man whose number he had committed to memory but had sworn he would never use. Captain Robert Wallace, his former the man who had handed him his discharge papers and told him to get some rest. Calling Wallace would be like opening a tomb. It would let all the ghosts out. But looking at the sleeping dog, at the SEAL trident tattooed in his ear, Jake knew he had no choice. This dog was a soldier, one of his own, and he had been left behind. Jake Callahan did not leave his people behind. Not again. Not ever. He picked up the phone. 2 days passed in a strange, tense quiet. Jake followed the vet's instructions to the letter. Feeding the dog Hidu started calling him Kaiser, a name that felt strong and noble. Small, precise meals. He cleaned his wounds. They spent their time in silence, 2 broken warriors finding a strange comfort in each other's damaged presence. Kazaran's strength began to return. The haunted look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a watchful, intelligent loyalty. He followed Jake everywhere, a silent 4-legged shadow. Captain Wallace hadn't answered. Jake had left a single, terse message. Sir, it's Callahan. I have a situation here. It involves one of our assets. It's urgent. He left his number and waited. The silence from the other end was unsettling. On the 3rd night, the rain started. A cold, relentless downpour that turned the farm into a sea of mud. Jake stood at the kitchen window, watching the darkness, a mug of coffee in his hands. Kaiser lay by the hearth where a small fire crackled, the first fire Jake had bothered to build all winter. The dog seemed at ease, but Jake felt a familiar tension coiling in his gut. The same feeling he used to get before a mission, the sense that the world was holding its breath. Kaiser suddenly lifted his head, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. His ears were erect, swiveling toward the front of the house, toward the long, muddy driveway. Jake went still. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. He couldn't hear anything over the drumming of the rain on the tin roof, but he trusted the dog's senses more than his own. He moved to the front door, peering through the grimy glass. Two sets of headlights were cutting through the rain, moving slowly up his driveway. They weren't from a standard car, the beams were too high, the vehicles too large. Two black, unmarked SUVs. Jake's blood turned to ice. This wasn't Wallace, this wasn't the law. This was trouble. Inside. He commanded in a low whisper. He didn't mean the house. He meant the seal inside him. The training slammed into place. Threat assessment, angles of approach, cover and concealment, weapons. He had no weapons. He'd sold his personal firearms long ago, wanting nothing more to do with them. A profound tactical error. The SUVs pulled to a stop in the yard, their headlights cutting yellow swaths through the downpour, illuminating the front of the house like a prison yard. Doors opened. Four men emerged, dressed in black tactical gear, moving with a fluid, professional discipline that Jake recognized instantly. Not military, not police. Mercenaries PMCs. Kaiser was at his side, no longer growling, but standing rigid, the fur on his back raised. He was ready. Jake backed away from the door, pulling Kaiser with him into the shadows of the living room. He scanned the room. The fireplace. Poker. A heavy cast iron skillet on the stove. Nothing. He was outgunned, outnumbered. This was a death trap. A heavy fist pounded on the front door. "We know you're in there, Callahan. We know you have the asset. Send it out, and we'll be on our way. Make this easy." The voice was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. Jake's mind raced. They knew his name. They knew about the dog. This was a recovery operation. They weren't here to negotiate. He had to move the back door, but they would have it covered. The windows were death traps. He was boxed in, the front door splintered as a battering ram smashed through the old wood. The war had come home. As the door crashed inwards, Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy oak rocking chair his grandmother had loved and hurled it toward the doorway. Not as a weapon, but as an obstacle. "Go," he yelled at Kaiser, pointing toward the back of the house. The first man through the door was a mountain, armored and holding a short-barreled rifle. He stumbled over the chair, and in that split second of imbalance, Jake struck. He drove forward, not with his fists, but with his shoulder, putting all his weight into the man's center of mass. The mercenary grunted, staggering back into the second man. Jake didn't stop to admire his work. He scrambled into the kitchen, his bad legs screaming. He grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove. It was heavy, solid, a decent improvised weapon. Two more men were coming around the side of the house, their flashlights cutting through the windows. He was flanked. Suddenly a blur of black and tan shot past him. Kaiser! He wasn't retreating, he was attacking. The dog launched himself, not at the men in the front, but toward the back door. With a crash of glass he smashed through the lower pane and disappeared into the stormy night. For a heart-stopping second Jake thought the dog was running, abandoning him. Then he heard a scream from outside, a wet, gurgling cry of agony followed by the sound of a body hitting the mud. Kaiser hadn't fled, he had flanked them. The two men in the front doorway recovered their footing and advanced into the house, their rifles sweeping the room. "Target is in the kitchen. Flankers report," one of them yelled into his radio. The only answer was static and the sound of the rain. Jake flattened himself against the wall beside the kitchen doorway, the heavy skillet held high. He controlled his breathing. One breath in, hold, one breath out. The world slowed down. There was only the sound of his own heart, the rain, and the tactical footfalls of the men coming for him. The first man entered the kitchen, his rifle preceding him. Jake swung the skillet in a vicious, horizontal arc. It connected with the side of the man's helmet with a sickening clang of metal on Kevlar. The man didn't go down, but he staggered, his ears ringing, his balance gone. Jake didn't give him time to recover. He drove the heel of his boot into the man's knee. The joint buckled with an audible pop, and the mercenary went down, howling in pain. The second man was already there, raising his rifle. Jake knew he was too late. He couldn't dodge. This was it. A black shape erupted from the darkness behind the second mercenary. Kaiser, having circled the house, launched himself through the ruined back doorway he had created. He hit the man square in the back, all 70 pounds of muscle and fury. The man crashed forward, his rifle discharging into the ceiling as he fell. Kaiser Ray jaws, designed for this exact purpose, clamped down on the man's shoulder, shaking his head with savage intensity. The first man Jake had downed was trying to raise a sidearm. Jake kicked it from his hand, the gun skittering across the linoleum floor. He stood over the two downed men, the skillet held ready, his chest heaving. Kaiser stood over his own quarry, a low, menacing growl. His only sound, it was over. For now, then he heard the voice from the front yard. The leader. Fall back! Fall back! Asset is hostile. Exfil now! Jake moved to the window. The two remaining mercenaries were dragging their wounded comrades back to the SUVs. They weren't fighting anymore. They were running. This wasn't a military operation. It was a corporate one. They were cutting their losses. The SUVs roared to life, their tires spinning in the mud as they executed a hasty three-point turn and sped back down the driveway, disappearing into the rain and the night. Silence descended, broken only by the rain, the crackle of the fire, and the pained whimpers of the man on his kitchen floor. Jake looked at Kaiser. The dog released his hold, his muzzle stained with blood. He looked at Jake, his tail giving a single tentative wag. He had done his duty. He had protected his handler. Jake knelt and ran a hand over the dog's head. Good boy, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Good boy. He looked around at the wreckage of his home, the shattered door, the broken glass, the two armed men groaning on his floor. He had survived. They had survived. But it was far from over. Those men would be back, and they would come better prepared. He looked down at the man whose knee he had shattered. Who sent you? Jake demanded, his voice a low growl. The man just spat a bloody curse at him. Jake knew he needed help. We'll help. He retrieved his phone. He dialed Wallace's number again. This time the captain answered on the first ring. Callahan, I was hoping you were exaggerating. Wallace Wabois was grim, weary. They came for him, sir, Jake said, his voice tight with adrenaline. 4 of them. PMCs. My house is a wreck, and I've got 2 of them incapacitated in my kitchen. They knew my name. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jake could hear the faint sound of keyboard clicks. They weren't supposed to know where you were. That data was sealed. Who are they, Captain? A company called Ares Studio Solutions, Wallace said. A shell corporation for a biotech firm. They got a deranged contract a few years back, Project Chimera. The goal was to breed the next generation of military working dogs. They used DNA from the best of the best heroes. Dogs like Odin. Jake's breath hitched. Odin, Marcus's dog. The program was a success, Wallace continued, his voice heavy. Too much of a success. The dogs were smarter, stronger, faster. But the Ethical Oversight Committee shut it down, deemed it too dangerous. The assets were ordered to be transferred to military custody for honorable retirement. All of them were accounted for, or so we thought. This one wasn't, Jake stated, looking at Kaiser, who was now licking his hand, the warrior replaced by the loyal companion. No, one of the lead scientists, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, faked the dog's death in the records, sold him to Ares. They wanted to reverse, engineer his genetics. This dog, Callahan. He's not just any dog. He's Odin's direct offspring. Genetically, he's one of the most valuable living assets the U.S. military has ever produced. The full weight of it settled on Jake. This wasn't just a rescue. He had stumbled into a conspiracy. Kaiser wasn't just a dog. He was a legacy, a priceless piece of a secret program, and the last living link to his best friend. They'll be back, sir, Jake said. I know, Wallace replied. And we'll be ready. I'm on my way. I'm bringing friends. Just hold on, Master Chief. Reinforcements are inbound. The line went dead. Jake looked at the two men on his floor, then at the magnificent animal standing guard beside him. He was no longer a ghost haunting a derelict farm. He was a soldier on a defensive perimeter, protecting his own, and he would not fail. An hour later, as the first hints of a bruised dawn bled over the horizon, the sound of rotors beat the air. Two black helicopters, sleek and menacing, descended on Jake's fallow field. Men in military fatigues, rappelled down, securing a perimeter with an efficiency that was beautiful to watch. Captain Wallace was the first one through the door. He was older, grayer, but his eyes held the same quiet authority, Jake remembered. He took in the scene, his shattered door, the subdued mercenaries being zip-tied by his men, Jake standing tall amidst the chaos, and the German shepherd at his side. Wallace looked at Kaiser, his expression a mixture of awe and sorrow. "My God," he whispered, "he has his father's eyes." He stepped forward and knelt, extending a hand to the dog. Kaiser sniffed it, then gave a respectful lick. "He's a good soldier," Jake said, his voice raw. "He's a hero's son," Wallace corrected gently. He stood and faced Jake. "Dr. Finch and the executives at Ares are being taken into federal custody as we speak. This whole ugly business is over." He paused. "Legally, this dog is government property. He should be taken to a secure facility." Jake's heart plummeted after everything. He was going to lose him. He looked at Kaiser, who looked back, a silent question in his intelligent eyes. The bond between them was more than man and animal. It was warrior to warrior, survivor to survivor. Wallace saw the look on Jake's face. He saw the way the man stood, the way the dog leaned against his leg. He saw two broken souls who had started to heal each other. A small, sad smile touched the captain's lips. "However," he continued, "the paperwork on Project Chimera is a bureaucratic nightmare. An asset that was officially declared deceased has now reappeared, and he seems to have bonded with a decorated, medically retired Master Chief who lives in the middle of nowhere and is uniquely qualified to handle an animal of his caliber." He clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder. "I'm going to have to file a report. It's going to take me a very, very long time to write. I'm a slow typist. By the time I'm done, I imagine the official record will state that Asset 7 Co. call sign Kaiser has been permanently assigned to his new handler for ongoing behavioral assessment and retirement integration, effective immediately." Tears welled in Jake's eyes, the first he had shed since the day he lost his team. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a wave of profound, overwhelming gratitude washing over him. Wallace's team cleaned up the mess, taking the mercenaries and their gear with them. As the helicopters lifted off, blowing dust and dead leaves across the yard, the farm fell silent once more. It was just Jake and Kaiser standing on the porch watching the sunrise. The fight was over. The ghosts were still there, but they were quieter now. Their angry shouts had faded to respectful whispers. In the eyes of the dog beside him, Jake didn't see a reflection of his own brokenness anymore. He saw a glimmer of a future 1 year later. The farm was no longer a graveyard. A new front door, painted a deep forest green, stood proudly in place of the shattered one. The broken windows were replaced, the porch steps were solid, and a neat stack of firewood stood ready for the winter. The fields weren't fallow anymore. A small but thriving vegetable garden grew near the house. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. It was healing. Jake Callahan sat on the top step, a mug of coffee in his hands. The scars were still there, on his neck and in his soul, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone. In its place was a quiet peace. The phantom pain in his leg was a dull ache he barely noticed anymore. Anya Sharmakar pulled up the now graded driveway. She got out, carrying a small bag from the local bakery. She had become a regular visitor, a friend. She'd check on Kaiser, who was now a magnificent animal, his coat thick and shining, his body a picture of health and strength. But mostly she came to check on Jake. "Morning, soldier," she said with a warm smile. "Morning, Doc," he replied, a genuine smile reaching his eyes from the newly repaired barn. A joyful bark echoed. Kaiser came bounding out, a tennis ball in his mouth. He ran to Jake, dropping the slobbery ball at his feet, his tail wagging with an infectious energy. Jake laughed, a real deep laugh that felt strange and wonderful. He picked up the ball and threw it far into the field. Kaiser took off like a rocket, a streak of pure, unadulterated joy. He and Anya watched the dog run, a perfect specimen of strength and grace, chasing a simple yellow ball under a bright, clear sky. He was no longer a secret asset or a genetic marvel. He was just a dog. Jake a dog. He looks happy, Anya said softly. We both are, Jake replied, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. He had gone into that dark shed a ghost, a man waiting to die. He had confronted a bully, fought a war, and faced the ghosts of his past. And in the eyes of a broken dog, he had found his way back. They had saved each other. Two old soldiers, finally home from the war, standing together in the light of a new day. The gate had been opened, and what came out was not a monster but a miracle. It was redemption. It was hope.